Pleiadian Perspectives on Human Evolution by Amora Kuan Yin, 1996. Published by Bear & Company. Foreword by Barbara Hand Clow. In her introduction for Pleiadian Perspectives, Amora Kuan Yin asks you to read the stories of the evolutionary histories of Venus, Mars, Maldek, which is the destroyed planet that has become the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and Earth, as if these ancient stories are your own stories. She asked me to write a foreword for this brilliant, time-sweeping, and fantastic journey, and because it is such advanced Pleiadian material, I honestly could not think of anyone else who could assist in preparing you for this truly amazing journey. For those of you who have read my latest book, The Pleiadian Agenda, A New Cosmology for the Age of Light, you will know that Kuan Yin and I, as well as others, are Pleiadian emissaries of light. Actually, many of you are also emissaries of light from many parallel realities. The difference is that Amora and I identified this part of our soul essence at a young age and then began creating out of it. Amora and I admit that we have remembered coming into Earth to assist her through her birthing canal. What is the birthing canal of Earth? It is us. Humans have become a body of ancient patterns that restrict Earth. More than 104,000 years ago, as recorded in the Aztec calendar of the fifth sun, we Pleiadians passed through the same transcendence that is now precipitating into your reality. All of you who remain in your bodies through 2012 will release control patterns that block Earth's natural ecstasy. Then you will live on her surface as fully grounded beings who participate in Earth evolvement with full access to the intelligence of the galaxy itself. You're not going out of your bodies. Instead, you are finally choosing to fully inhabit your bodies. We are here to reach you now because Earth has released a great cry into the galaxy. Earth is keening over your limited sense of self. We Pleiadians are excited as we feel you waking up and manifesting the conscious expression of Earth's desires, because we know you will remember the great cosmic ecstasy that we enjoy all the time. Why? Because we discovered how to live without limitation. We ask you, who said Earth was limited? We Pleiadian emissaries are here now as guides to assist you in seeing the universe of light, a universe that defines matter as darkness, or Earth as conscious and manifested creativity and thought. You are ready now to play freely in her garden. As a person who is conscious of my own Pleiadian heritage, like Kuan Yin, I have inner records on the evolution of Mars, Venus, Maldek, and Earth. I forgot about these grand dualities and grand dramas when I was born. As I read Kuan Yin's stories, I went through a process of identifying many sources of the inner conflicts that I've dealt with all of my life. I could better see how these repetitive conflicts are merely old residues of mental junk littering human minds. I say merely with a dose of irony, because that is the litter that is manifesting in physical form as all of the toxic waste piled up all over the planet. Perhaps because of my assiduously developed Pleiadian eye, I see easily how these stories are the basis for subconscious patterning in the human mind. It is my hope that you will have a similar experience, because we all live on this planet together. The toxic waste emanating from the mental junk in your brains is poisoning our garden. I ask you to deeply contemplate these ancient records. They reveal the subconscious patterns that threaten your home. And as you read about them, this simple action will cause them to break down. Space will open for the rising of the new and potent evolutionary spiral. It is time for you to see clearly that what you think about creates your world, and your inner brains look exactly like junkyards. My personal expertise for putting this book in context comes from writing the Mind Chronicles trilogy. When I wrote these books from 1984 through 1992, I discovered a whole new method for reading materials that effectively accesses and sorts out data in ancient stories. As Kuan Yin says about Ra, Pleiadian Archangel of Light, who is the past, present, and future lens of this book, how you look through the lens of Ra will determine how much you can really see about your own profound subconscious patterning. Now that Earth is crying for you to attain this galactic lens as you live on her surface, each one of you who transcends these patterns actually makes space for Earth to breathe again. By creating the book Eye of the Centaur, Volume 1 of the trilogy, I dumped out my own memory banks and entered into the present moment. By creating Heart of the Christos, Volume 2, I forgave myself for everything I'd ever done, and I raise all of those experiences up and into my heart. By creating Signet of Atlantis, Volume 3, I was able to contemplate the originating sources of these subconscious patterns, off-planet races who have been involved in human evolution since we chose to become conscious and then self-reflective. Once the primordial sense of self emerged, other intelligences entered into relationship with us, since sense of self is what opens any being to relationship potential. Now it is time to recognize these ancient partners in the Garden of Eden. This book demonstrates that all of us have experienced the full spectrum of human history and behavior. As you remember your own participation in evolution while listening to these stories, consider that your ability to see this is your earthly responsibility, your ability to respond. As Kuan Yin says, a speck of everything possible exists within you. This puts you on the spot because if you judge others, that part of you that has done the same thing is judged and suffers. This wave of suffering is what is now causing Earth to rebel from the burden. Earth herself will breathe, see light, and enfold you if you only will transcend these attitudinal energies, as Kuan Yin so aptly named these stumbling blocks. My trilogy, The Mind Chronicles, helped me to birth a new method, shamanic reading, for moving beyond judgment, and that is what I would like to share with you. Many of you who've bought this book love to read because reading is your most precious opportunity to be alone and contemplate your mind without any other stimulation. Reading can be pure contemplation. When you read correctly, you actually alter your physical body by allowing feelings to enter into the process as your mind is stimulated. When you are all alone reading and not being influenced by other vibrations, if you read correctly, you are free. What is correct reading? It is avid attention to each thought that is presented so that you either agree with that thought and imprint it, or you hold that thought as a concept and consider it over time. Or you decide that you disagree with that thought and you clear your mind of it and anything else that changes in your own thought bank as a result of considering a new idea. When you hold thoughts as potential new concepts, you use the storage powers of your mind to hold them in creative tension while you allow your feelings to explore your reactions. You come to a conclusion once you can feel something is right. When you clearly reject thoughts, you are clearing and cleaning your mind. Shamanic reading is a process of building databanks by strengthening and clarifying your mind with thoughts that you feel or know are true. As you build creative tension with thoughts that have the power to rile up your subconscious patterning. It is by means of this creative tension that subconscious patterning can be brought to light and transcended. That is the alchemy of the mind, the doorway into untapped intelligence. Amora Kuan Yin is a writer for this kind of reading, and since thought creates reality, worlds can shift as you read and listen. The reason 90% of your brain is untapped is simply because 90% of your brain is littered with unconsidered judgments. Even if you later decide this book is not truth for you, I would advise you to read and listen to this book as if the stories of the 4 worlds in it contain the keys for tapping your unused brain material. The first step in successful shamanic reading is to respect the writer's offering by opening yourself totally to the exquisite communication link the writer is simply offering to you. Out of honest respect for this gift, hold your judgment about this writer and these words until later, just as you reserve judgment about someone who sexually attracts you until you know it is appropriate to pursue those feelings of attraction. This request assumes you selected this book carefully, just as I hope you select your lovers carefully. Just like with those who want to be your lovers, you can always stop reading a book and give it to someone else if you conclude that it has nothing to offer you. But reading can even be better than sex from one point of view. A library of books is a wonderful thing, but most would suggest caution about a pile of lovers. Assuming this book actually can tap your latent brain power and strengthen your mind, then, as you open yourself to this process, be like a child. Now is your chance to allow deeply buried ancient memories to bubble up to the surface of your mind, so you can consider them in light of all that you've learned for thousands of years. You may find that you can hardly relate to old dilemmas, and you may discard them easily, so you can make new images, imaginate, to create new worlds. So, here you are, sufficiently open. Some of you may want to also set up a magical space for reading or listening. You may want candles, incense, divination cards or runes, or other magical objects that trigger your own feeling mind. Why? Let me be honest. This is a heavy book, and playing with it will ease your feelings as you take in the stories. Remember to breathe. How could it be easy to consider the spiralic struggles engendered by our ascension into self-reflective intelligence? How could it be easy to look at our actions coming out of reaching for the divine? As for me, I cried when I read certain parts of this book. This book has made it difficult to even have football games playing on the television set. I never watch them, because now football makes me think of Martian war games. It was painful to contemplate how rare is simple, playful, Venusian ecstasy on Earth these days. Shamanic reading means feeling a book instead of just reading or listening to distract yourself from real life. However, reading is also mental, and unless you follow the mental process in a book, you can't read. So again, carefully monitor the new material that fits with the truth you already have, and take responsibility for your own data bank. Hold the stuff you're not sure about at the conceptual level so you can observe how it feels. When you feel material getting into your gut and stirring you up, bypass mental arguments with the Pleiadians, with Amora Kuan Yin, or the voice in your head from some old professor or grade school teacher or parent or priest, and just feel this book. Drop the mentalism, abstracting ideas from feelings, and just feel what you're taking in. Open yourself to it. Stop and cry if you need to. Light a candle as you feel the wind responding to your mind opening. Give yourself time and space to handle remembering something that once put you in prison or caused you to be murdered, and then see how that attitudinal energy exists as a block in your brain about similar emotional dilemmas in your present-day reality. Let those feelings rip through your nerves, your emotions, and your guts. Just hold with that awful truth you've found. Hold it long enough to open the window in your blocked brain. Then you will remember what is blocking you now is only an old memory of something you thought someone else did, or you thought you did yourself, when in fact everybody did it to everyone. And the only new possibility is to stop it all now. The only reason to read a book in these days is because the book amuses and entertains you, or because the book can clean out your brain so you can really see what is actually happening to you in your world. When you read something in this book, Pleiadian Perspectives on Human Evolution, that stirs you up, it's because you are realizing that this old junk is still recreating your same reality now. Consider cleaning out your brain so Earth can cleanse and emerge into her original intention to have you live freely on her surface in the sacred garden. Then you will contemplate the light without averting your eyes. Then the great inner night, your mind, will become enlightened, and you will open your eyes to see the exquisite, deep greenness that is this earth. Barbara Ann Clow, Lakeville, Connecticut, January 1996. Preface and acknowledgements. When the manuscript for this book was nearly done, I drew a card from the Mayan oracle deck and asked the question, what symbol most accurately describes the higher purpose and destiny of this book? The card I drew was called Resolution of Duality, which reads, this is tone 2. Now is the time for you to confront directly the illusion of separation and duality. Receiving this lens asks you to resolve your separate sense of identity. Bring awareness to the way you hold duality pairs, such as good and bad, right and wrong, them and us. Such pairs support the very framework of our presently transforming third-dimensional reality. Duality is simply a perception. Polarities are thought to be opposites only because of the way we perceive them. In the collective trance, you have probably been taught to understand polarities from the position of separation and duality. Duality is the transformational playing field, and it is maintained only by the belief systems held in mass consciousness. As you personally integrate your polarities and transmute your limiting beliefs, your reality is transformed. As your reality is transformed, collective reality also shifts, revealing a greater reality of inseparable unity. In receiving this lens, you are being challenged to work with your belief systems, collective issues, and thought forms to see where they appear to limit you. Your very complexity and rigidity invite new processes frequencies that open you to simplicity, expansion, and change. You will feel this energy working in any area of your life that has become too complicated or inflexible. Since your own personal issues are connected to mass consciousness, you also contribute to the transformation of the whole. You are the resolution of duality. This lens asks you to look at reality from the perspective of the gift that is inherent in duality. With that perception, you will be helping to support a quantum leap into the new reality. Remember, you and planetary consciousness are engaged in the evolutionary process of resolving duality. End quote. This message is so perfect. As you move through the stories of the evolutionary histories of Venus, Mars, Maldek, and their culmination on Earth, and more, you will be reading your own inner stories. Whether you lived physically on any planet in this solar system or others, or your soul was created and born on Earth, these stories are deeply ingrained in your subconscious patterning. Throughout all of our many lives, we have contacted and experienced most of the myths within these pages. It does not matter whether we have white, red, black, or yellow skin in this lifetime. We have lived inside all of those colors of skin during the precession of our lives. Whether your place of origin is the Pleiades, Sirius, or the far reaches of this universe, you have experienced human incarnations in civilizations comprised of young souls evolving from the lower dimensions upward, and of those who have downstepped from the higher dimensions to experience third dimensional reality. You have been born into cultures whose genetic origins are Andromedan, Pleiadian, Sirian, Lyran, and many for which we do not even have names as of yet. It also does not matter if you can trace your current life's roots into, for example, a purely Balinese, French, English, or Native American heritage. Although those cultures may carry specific genetic lineage from the Pleiades, Venus, Lyra, or the Big Dipper, they have also been influenced and infiltrated by other genetic lineages throughout the ages. And even though their primary origins are genetically intact, the very fact that your own origins are unlikely to be the same as your current bloodlines makes it all strictly experiential. You see, Earth has been chosen as the home of the universal melting pot. We are all the potpourri for existence, the great experiment of unity within diversity. Our souls have become the melting pot of all of our experiences, genetically, dimensionally, and actually. Therefore, the divination for this book, the card Resolution of Duality, is perfect. If you hold prejudice within you toward another race, that part of you that has been incarnate in that race is rejected and suffers. If you judge others, that part of you that has done the same thing is judged and suffers. If you blame and guilt trip others, you truly blame and guilt trip that part of yourself that has been like them, and you suffer. It is impossible to harm and disrespect other living beings, including animals and plants, without harming yourself. A speck of everything possible exists within you, and a speck of you exists within all that is. So when you create duality through your thoughts, judgments, attitudes, actions, and beliefs, you help strengthen darkness, which is the illusion of separation and untruth. Through the channelings from Ra, a Pleiadian archangel of the light, I offer a lens through which to view your own past, present, and future. The attitude with which you look through this lens makes all the difference. It is intended to give you an opportunity to see and understand your own patterns and those of others. You have most likely transcended many of the behavioral, attitudinal, and karmic patterns contained within the planetary histories. Those you have not are illuminated clearly enough that you can get a better look at yourself. Acknowledge, praise, and congratulate yourself on those areas in which you have achieved transformation and transcendence. Acknowledge, show compassion and mercy, and employ spiritual discipline to those areas in which you have not. Use this spiritual and historical evolutionary journey to find true humility, forgiveness, and compassion for others as well. When you discover an area that depicts one of your own stumbling blocks, notice whether your first response is self-judgment, shame, guilt, or self-condemnation. If so, take the time to clear and release these attitudinal energies. The techniques for clearing judgments, beliefs, and perfect pictures given in Chapter 6 of my previous book, the Pleiadian Workbook, Awakening Your Divine Ka, are ideal to use as you find a need for them. In fact, the planetary histories in this manuscript were originally part of my first book, the Pleiadian Workbook. They were intended to trigger the readers of that book with awareness of their own beliefs, prejudices, and karmic patterns, and then present the spiritual healing and alignment tools with which to clear them. Whether you have read and done the exercises in that Pleiadian Workbook or not, you will benefit and learn by continuing with this book now. I highly recommend, if you have not experienced the Pleiadian Workbook, that you do so after completing this book in order to make the most out of the spiritual transformation and growth offered. Also, I hope you will allow this journey through time and space to be both deepening and filled with fun and wonder. As the channelings came through my own higher self channel from Ra, I recorded them into my computer, somewhat like automatic writing. I never knew what was coming until I actually typed it onto the computer. At times, the stories would haunt me, and I would dream about them afterward. I often saw my own past or present tendencies in those of the Venusians, the Martians, and the Meldekians. When the Earth chapter was being channeled, I spent about 1/3 of the time I was typing it into the computer with tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. The stories of the fairies, the mer people, and Ma-Ra reached deep places in my own heart and soul memories. As the stories were given to me, I saw the visions, felt the energies of the people, heard the messages from Ra, and typed them all at the same time. I had no idea that Ma-Ra was the future Mother Mary until the unfolding story revealed her identity. Then the tears truly flowed. As the original spiritual meaning of baptism as a sacred ceremony to acknowledge an individual's divine sovereignty was revealed, I wept aloud. Ancient feelings of remembrance were aroused in me about baptism being an initiatic stage in which the initiate was acknowledged as having transcended ego. At that point, the person was also acknowledged as being of pure intent, with the veils of illusion washed away and ready to be held accountable as a sovereign spiritual being. Once again, I feel I have been greatly gifted indeed to be given the honor of channeling and remembering the evolutionary stories presented in this book. The writing process has been life-changing, at times challenging, and always heart-opening for me along the way. If you allow it to, it can move you deeper into your own remembering and purification. It can also help you release the past. As we learn to forgive, accept, and love ourselves, we learn to forgive, accept, and love others. The more we forgive, accept, and love others, the more we forgive, accept, love, and respect ourselves. The truth is that it is impossible to experience inner wholeness and to have total self-esteem and self-respect until we do so. Therefore, in the spirit of resolution of duality and unity within diversity, which are the last steps towards wholeness and oneness with God, Goddess, all that is, Ra and I offer this book to be used as your own shamanic journey. May it be an impeccable one. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge and express deepest gratitude to the Ascended Masters, Mother Mary, and Jesus Christ for the supreme examples they have given us of what we truly are and what we are becoming again. To all of the Ascended Masters who have gone before us, thank you for your ongoing dedication and loving guidance on the initiatic path home. I also acknowledge and thank all of the Pleiadian emissaries of light, and especially Ra, for their wise, impeccable, and always loving presences and service to Earth's divine plan. I send gratitude and love to myself and to all of us who have had the courage to question reality, to demand to know truth, and to challenge our own beliefs and desires when they have proven to be limits to oneness. The students I have taught during the time period in which this book was written have been such great sources of inspiration and courage to me along the way. Many blessings and thanks to all of you. Especially, I would like to thank Mr. Cree and Rosemary for opening your homes and hearts to me while I'm in Phoenix. Guy Lone Eagle, you are a friend and colleague beyond measure. Thank you for choosing to share yourself and your sacred process of unfolding with me. I thank the entire Phoenix class for demonstrating new depth to the meaning of the word willingness, as you consistently exceed your own previous limits, face your fears, and become more. To my Mount Shasta classes, I honor the unity within diversity you have demonstrated with one another, your ability and willingness to suspend judgment, to resolve duality, and to open your eyes to see the true beauty in all things and people have been deeply moving. I also appreciate your enthusiastic and sincere support of me and my life purpose. I acknowledge Gail Vivino for the initial copy editing of the Venus, Mars, and Maldek materials, and for her personal feedback and appreciation of these materials. Jerry Clow dedicated himself to the copy editing of the finished work in a thorough, thoughtful, and beautiful way. It was fun sharing the special energy of the deer stories with you, Jerry, and of the other steps, conferences, and stories along the way. Barbara Ann Clow, I must first acknowledge you for the incredible gift you have given all of us with your latest book, The Pleiadian Agenda, A New Cosmology for the Age of Light. As you first described the materials in this book and my Pleiadian workbook as companions to your new book, I am deeply honored. You are a true sister, colleague, and inspiration to me in so many ways. Thank you for recognizing this material and its place in the scheme of things. Thank you for the pleasure of working with you in the publishing process. And thank you for doing it all with so much love, forthrightness, and supreme dedication. As with writing the Pleiadian workbook, the process of writing this book demanded so much that I had very little time or energy left over for my friends and godchildren. Thank all of you for being so patient, understanding, and loving, and for sharing the vision. I gratefully honor Brinna Waldman's creative expertise that comes forth in the illustrations throughout this book. You have made this book much more fun, and the lives of the Venusians, Martians, and Maldekians so much more real and accessible through your inspired visual adornments. I am also grateful to all of the people from Bear and Company, who have been and continue to be involved in bringing this and other sacred writings to the public. And for the beautiful job you, Lightborn and Bill Binger, did on the cover, bravo. Part 1. Colonization of Venus. The following story is channeled directly from Ra. Signature plants. Before this solar system was inhabited by self-aware physical life forms, some of the planets were breeding grounds for bacterial and amoebic life, as well as plant species. We, the Pleiadian emissaries of light, were the caretakers and grew many kinds of trees, flowers, shrubs, herbs, vining plants, and sea vegetation, as well as simple life forms. What you call herbs, we call signature plants. This name is derived from the fact that this particular group of plants was genetically engineered to carry specific geometric creation signatures that have the ability to align or realign their environments to match their signatures. Your botanical group entitled Signature Plants is quite different from our use of this term. Earth's scientists refer to obvious physical appearance of a plant structure as reason for designation as a signature plant, whereas we refer only to the cellular geometric creation signature as the criteria for that designation. The capabilities of signature plants to impact other species upon being consumed have been tested in many different environments and species since the creation of these plant forms, and it is why they are so effective when used properly. These signature plants, when ingested into human or animal bodies, seek out the places in the bodies where the same geometric signatures exist and regenerate and nurture those areas. When cellular mutations or miasmas occur in a particular area of your body, the cells in that area have their own genetic creation signature. If you ingest a plant whose genetic creation signature matches that of the mutated cells, the plant begins the work of healing the area and restoring the integrity of the cells. Many other planets have also served as breeding and testing grounds in addition to Earth. In fact, Venus was the first planet, other than Earth, in this solar ring to be inhabited. Solar ring is our name for what you call a solar system. Venus, Mars, and then Maldek were developed and first populated with bacteria and amoebic strains, then with plants, and ending with flowering plants and trees. When these species were reproducing naturally, and the necessary strains of plant life for self-mobilized life forms to feed on were thriving, something akin to tadpoles were created there. You might think of it as if we took a spark of consciousness and implanted it into a multicellular body that had been in incubation. Its only awareness at the point of birth was the instinctual impulse to eat in order to survive and grow. That instinct and the mobility of the form were the two factors that originally distinguished animal life from plant life. Earth was the last planet in your solar ring to be impregnated, so to speak, with animal species, as the divine plan for habitation and spiritual evolution unfolded. armada of Andromeda. Prior to the preparation of the varying planets for mobile life forms, a group of angelic beings from Andromeda had requested the opportunity to experience self-motivation and sovereignty. When this request was approved by the hierarchies for this galaxy, by the androgynous supreme being named An, and by the Elohim, higher council of 12, a plan was set into motion. This plan, which we have called the Armada of Andromeda, laid our planetary laws for those who would be born into physical forms, and was agreed upon by An, the higher council of 12 Elohim, and the angels or future humanoids. This was not the first time an entire group of beings had made such a request. Other galaxies had experienced similar transitions, as serving angels and other beings had made choices for their own devolutionary learning experiences and succeeded. They wanted to experience creativity, sensation, and emotions, and not just continue serving and following instructions. This desire is a normal part of evolution and awakening for many groups of beings, though not all of them. What was unique about this plan was that the angelic group mutually agreed not to have a hierarchical being or beings embodied to rule them. They wanted to evolve enough to rule themselves. They wanted to start out as sovereign beings, learning through experience. This created quite a stir throughout existence, as it had previously been believed and upheld that it was both impossible and unethical for beings not to be ruled by higher-ups. Some of the angels decided to remain in etheric form and serve as plant devas and future animal devas, and to assist in maintaining the necessary food chain and atmospheric conditions. Others volunteered to take turns being guides and guardian angels for each other, while those who chose to do so incarnated into physical bodies. Since the planetary orbits and weather conditions had been stabilized prior to the forming of the physical Venusian race, there was little need for concern or supervision on those levels beyond what was already maintained by light beings from the galactic center and from Alcyone, the central sun of the Pleiades. Alcyone had been chosen long before as the main control and monitoring station for life forms in your solar ring, so it was natural to continue in that role. All involved agreed that the hierarchies could observe but not interfere with the development of lifestyle and social forms. The upper dimensional guardians could intervene to prevent beings from other dimensions from invading or trying to take over. No spiritual teachings could be given other than those that had meaning to the angels from their own previous experiences as servants of the Elohim. Natural changes, which you would call disasters, could neither be prevented nor caused. In other words, in every way, other than that of ultimate oneness, the forthcoming Venusian race would be a sovereign race, unruled and undisciplined by hierarchies, physically or etherically. The excitement this plan created might loosely be likened to the atmosphere just before a long-anticipated horse race, prior to which everyone has decided upon their favorite chosen outcome, but in which no one knows for sure what the result would be. Multiply this excitement a few thousand times over, and you might begin to get the idea. The only other intervention to be allowed from the hierarchies prior to the end of the first natural 5,200-year cycle was anything that which the majority of the population agreed upon and requested. Otherwise, the new Venusians would be left alone. Understand that the time frames of which we speak are very loose translations of the actual time cycles on Venus, as well as those on Mars and Maldek in upcoming references. Since the length of days, nights, seasons, years, and all other time passages are different on each planet, it is impossible to speak of actual time and have it make any sense to you at all on Earth. Therefore, I will use Earth's evolutionary and orbital time frame as metaphorical equivalents to evolutionary cycles on these other planets. In relating time passages, in general, the arrival of humanoid forms will begin at the year 0 and proceed upward in number to reflect how many years humans lived on Venus when events occurred. The arrival of the Andromedan angels, year 0. The first group of Andromedan angels was transported to Venus. Their light bodies were decelerated until they became physical, and they began life in humanoid forms. At first, of course, the discovery process took all their attention, since they had not been prepared for what to expect beyond the needs for sustenance, sleep, sex for reproduction, and the tactile nature of feeling, at least as well as that could have been explained to beings who had never been in a physical body. Discovery of physical sensations and curiosity about them were full-time life experiences for the first few hundred years. Then, creativity for pleasure versus creativity for survival and maintaining comfort came into play. Music was the first area to be explored and developed creatively. The creation of instruments that could reproduce remembered etheric sounds became an obsession. With this creation came competition to see who could produce the truest and purest sounds with the most beautiful instruments. Class division, year 1200. For over 500 years, musical development was the most prestigious and fulfilling occupation for skilled Venusians. Those with less natural ability in music than others became the first minor class, although their service to the musicians, singers, and instrument makers was still highly valued and praised. At the end of the first 1200 years, the social structure pretty much reflected the following order of importance: highly esteemed musicians and singers, highly achieved instrument designers and makers, middle-class musicians and singers, middle-class instrument designers and makers, middle-class producers of instruments designed by others, middle-class servers of the higher class, lower-class musicians and singers, lower-class instrument makers, and finally, lower-class servers of the middle class. Even though the class divisions were clearly intact, there was still an absence of crime, and sovereignty was honored for all beings. However, after 1200 years of Venusian civilization, another class began to emerge as a result of incest. No one knew of genetic problems with inbreeding, nor did they have social or moral codes to inhibit it. So the natural genetic product of incest began to make themselves obvious. Deformed and ugly children began to be born. This was not exclusive to any class or group, of course, since the process of mating was impulsive, innocent, and unrestrained by any social norms. With the first appearances of deformity and malformation, or ugliness, the Venusians united in their mutually shared discovery process to correct the problem. At first it was only a problem to be understood and solved, but gradually it became another source of class division and discrimination. In the beginning, the exceptionally beautiful people, by common standard, came to the conclusion that they should isolate themselves and breed only with others like themselves in order to prevent the possible contagion. Of course, they found themselves rapidly increasing the frequency of production of the ugly mutations, as well as developing the further complications of mental instability and low-grade retardation. Retarded people, at that point in evolution, were no more than what we today would consider people with slightly below average IQs, or people who are slower mentally and less able to function analytically and creatively. Beauty and intelligence were quickly added to musical ability in determining a person's inherent value. Venusians with more beauty, intelligence, and musical ability were considered better than those with deformity, less physical beauty, or lack of creative skill. Prejudice and its sister, arrogance, were born of fear and grew into full adulthood rapidly. It took nearly 300 years for the Venusians as a group to understand the genetic source of their problem and to stop inbreeding. Once they discovered the cause, the decision was soon made to not allow the ugly and retarded ones to reproduce. These people became the lower class servers exclusively and carried the shame of the race, even though they were not outwardly shamed or ridiculed. This was because, at that point in history, the Venusians still realized they were co-creating a new world and felt responsible for the co-creation of genetic defects. They even assured the incest-born victims, who could not have children, that they would be provided for as long as they lived, and they kept that promise. Any future deformed and ugly ones would be killed at birth, thus eliminating the embarrassing problem and preserving the purity of the race. Recognize this motivation in Hitler's justification for slaughtering Jews and others in World War II? The ugly ones form a new colony, year 1500. These rules worked for a while until some of the victims decided to leave the inhabited areas and establish their own colony. There they could remain sovereign sexually and reproductively, as well as in every other way of life. Although there was much concern and disagreement about this decision between the people on both sides, the incest victims' right to choose sovereignty was upheld, and they left with the bare necessities to begin anew. The new colony quickly established itself in a separate region, and its members began new and promising lives. They refound the old values of equality and self-worth that had been lost to them, and rediscovered the soul and being-level qualities of inner beauty, love, and divine truth. They cultivated these spiritual qualities and longed to share them with the original colony members, but feared rejection and ridicule. They knew they were considered simpletons as well as ugly, even though the original people outwardly showed them only compassion and tolerance. In the meantime, the so-called beautiful people felt a sense of release at not even having to see the so-called ugly and retarded ones their race had created. They secretly felt less threatened with their victims out of sight, and became more and more enthralled with their own beauty, intelligence, and musical skill. Theater was also in its early developmental stages, contributing great new inspiration and a new opportunity for prestige among peers. Writers, actors and actresses, and costume and set designers joined the ranks of the higher and middle classes, and Venusian evolution continued. The original Venusians maintained the genetic purity of their race, experiencing only rare instances of ugly or deformed babies, who they continued to kill at once. However, they grew increasingly arrogant and competitive. The value systems being rediscovered and evolved spiritually by their forgotten victims were scarcely even remembered by these so-called beautiful people, and eventually they were forgotten altogether. Even members within the same class began to compete with one another to determine who was the very best, not just one of the best. This was a new development. The camaraderie of sharing similar talents and social status deteriorated into out-and-out rivalry. Initially, this competition involved only physical appearance, intelligence, and creative talents, but it soon expanded into jealousy and competition for lovers, the winner claiming to be the most beautiful and worthy, the loser secretly plotting revenge and self-redemption. All the while, denial of spiritual value and spiritual beauty grew proportionately to obsession with physical form and physical accomplishment. Creation of beauty through physical art forms joined the list of desirable accomplishments by this time, around 2,000 years into the Venusian history, and added yet another area of competition and class division. Those who could not produce music or art found other ways of climbing the social ladder when a form of currency exchange was invented. Of course, as it was intended to do, the currency system rewarded the artisans of all types more highly than the farmers, clothiers, and other common folk. So those from families of great instrument makers who had accumulated beautiful possessions and wealth were also among the elite by virtue of inheritance. Their greatest talent was in knowing how to benefit themselves at the expense of others. This class of elite boasted that they collected the best art and were entertained by the best musicians, and thus had superior taste and social worth. By the time the original colony had fully developed to this extent, 3,500 years had passed. Class division was an absolute, and sovereignty was an ideal only to those who were poor, and a distorted joke to the rich. Crime begins, year 3,500. Resentment, hostility, jealousy, envy, prejudice, and revenge replaced co-creation, awareness, and sovereignty, as well as the long-forgotten spiritual equality and spiritual beauty. The lower classes began to rebel and demand sovereignty. Their first official step occurred when a group of the poor decided to go on strike, as you would call it, demanding that all the inhabitants of their sector join them for a large meeting to air their complaints. They attempted to express their need to be seen as valuable beyond the service they provided to the upper classes. They reminded their oppressors that they served as vital members of the community, providing the bare necessities of labor such as growing food, washing clothes, and other common jobs. They told the rich and middle-class Venusians that the wealth must be distributed more evenly and fairly, and that they had come to the planet to co-create, not to dominate or be dominated. The upper class mostly huffed and turned up their noses, saying those were old tales, creation myths, that even if those stories were true, it was obvious that equality was a lie, as they had proven through their own obvious superiority. At this point, a few of the Venusian men began to make their way forward from the back of the crowds, where they had agreed to wait peacefully, while the milder-mannered delegates spoke to the crowd. They began pushing people along the way, inciting more anger and hatred among the people. Eventually, the crowd broke out into fighting. Poor women pulled at the hair of rich women, grabbing jewelry and shawls and anything else that was easily detachable. The rich women and men hit them, kicked them, and violently tried to stop the thievery, while the lower-class men engaged in fistfights with the upper-class men. The whole thing ended in the murder of a wealthy art collector and writer who had especially provoked the less fortunate men and was accidentally beaten to death. The man's wife screamed out, "He's dead! My husband is dead, and these barbarians have killed him!" A hush went through the entire group, and all fighting ceased at once. Some of the poorer women handed back the things they had taken. Others simply ran in fear of punishment, and the crowd silently disbanded. The next day, about half the lower-class men and a few of the womenfolk refused to go to work for the upper-class people. They pledged to only provide for their own families and themselves from that point forth, unless their requests were honored. Instead of meeting these requests, the upper classes put their heads together and agreed not to rehire those who had gone on strike, to increase hours and benefits to those who remained faithful, and to go on with life as usual. Naturally, this incited more anger and hatred in everyone. The upper classes had taken another step in ruling over the lower classes, praising the faithful ones for their subservience and threatening to cut them off if they were seen fraternizing with the rebels. The rebels hated the servants who continued to work. They began to steal from them, and occasionally to intimidate them with threats and minor skirmishes. The faithful servants hated the upper class for the power they held over their own lives. They had succumbed to fear of survival and deserted their fellow lower-class friends. They likewise were angry with their former friends for putting them in the position of choice. They felt mixed feelings of guilt, shame, anger, and hatred towards their old lower-class friends, and they began to look down on them as well. Now, let us take a look back in history at the seed of this confusion denial, oppression, prejudice, and deeply hidden emotions. Yes, it goes back to the genetic impairments created through incest. Although the original violators were ignorant and naive about genetic damage from incest at the time the problem occurred, they still felt the sting of fear and shame at its discovery. Those who remained the so-called beautiful people were secretly disgusted with and terrified by these mutants their race had created. They denied the fear that this could happen to them, as well as shame that they had helped to cause it. Resentment was felt towards the so-called ugly and retarded ones for reminding them of their own shame. This fear of ugliness and retardation haunted their dreams and every waking moment. These negative feelings were never acknowledged outwardly. Instead, the so-called beautiful ones overcompensated with more arrogance, false compassion, and agreement to allow the mutants to leave and create their own colony. The Venusians missed the opportunity to learn more about compassion and love of the sacred essence in each person, choosing to feed their obsession with the outer form perfection instead. There was, of course, conscious relief and release of tension when the mutants left, but deep down inside, the Venusians always held a fear of being inferior in any way. The fact that the mutants existed anywhere on their planet was a deep source of pain. The shadow side of consciousness was born into the subconscious of these so-called beautiful people, and they became addicted to physical beauty and artistic expression as an overcompensation for their fear, shame, resentment, lack of compassion, and lack of love, and their prejudices. And yet, they maintained a so-called pure race. Correspondingly, the so-called mutants developed a much more spiritually based culture, and one that excelled at agriculture. Music, theater, and art developed in their colony as well, and yet the bitter sting of old remembered prejudices and superiorities kept these arts in balance with the rest of their lives. They were as careful as they could be to prevent further genetic impairment through obvious incest, and yet they were a race with damaged genes to start with. Though the pull to reunite with the original colony was always there to some degree, their own buried shadow side kept them isolated. They carried deep scars of shame and fear of their own physical inferiority. This fear and shame were masked by their spiritual beliefs in equality, sovereignty, and inner beauty, and yet the wounds lay untended emotionally. The so-called mutants found respectable work for even the most simple-minded among them. They shared with one another equally. They sang and worshipped spiritually together, and they grew as a race. However, the genetic damage was quite real and still with them, since genetic impairment also impeded their souls and spirits from being able to completely embody and function in full capacity. The paradox was that each colony deeply needed what the other had. The so-called beautiful people who were so physically obsessed needed the spiritual purity and memory of innocence of the genetically impaired. The mutant race needed the genetic purity to enable them to recover lost abilities and full soul embodiment. And yet, neither could get past their own buried scars and denial to realize their mutual needs. Even though many miles apart, they were on the same planet. Therefore, what affected one group had psychological and subconscious impact on the other. Criminals leave the original colony year 3800. At about 3,800 years into Venusian colonization, a group of the criminal rebels from the original colony set out to recolonize elsewhere in order to get a fair start again. By that time, theft and murder were beginning to run rampant, and rape had been introduced. This new form of violent punishment was a direct reflection of people's deep anger and their need to punish others for having what they wanted and thought they could not have. Raping their bodies removed the sterility and hatred of separation and said to the rape victims, "See, you're no better than I am because I have the ability to take from you what you say you won't give." The false sense of power bred by this latest violence imposed on the middle class and upper classes led to civil war. The lower class rebels had no chance of winning, and so they organized, stole supplies, and left during the night for hills in the far west. 1 month after their departure from the original colony, the rebels sighted the mutant colony. A humble city stood on a hillside rich in green pastures, rivers and streams, wildflowers, and a natural beauty previously unseen by the rebels. Their reaction was a mixture of shock and fear. Since they had learned to sneak around unnoticed, they decided to send spies in after dark to observe the people. The spies returned 2 days later, reporting a very quiet, humble group of so-called strange and ugly people living simple lives. Everyone appeared to be calm, reasonably happy, and equally provided for. This news left the rebels quite surprised and hopeful, although fear of so-called ugliness was deeply buried in their racial subconscious and made them cautious. They decided to send a delegation of men, women, and children to meet the people and ask if they could join them. The so-called mutant race listened to their stories of woe and discrimination. The rebels had agreed, however, not to report their own criminal acts to these new people in the hope of being accepted. They also were holding on to righteous anger and hatred, which is by far the most dangerous kind. Within a few days, the newcomers were being woven into the community like new strands of thread into an existing tapestry. They were fed and sheltered in the homes of the mutants until their own shelters could be constructed. Some of the rebels found it easy to let go of the old ways of violence and competition. Others did not. Those who did not began to steal unnecessarily, taking tools, knives, and special foods they had not had before and for which they were afraid to ask. As this behavior was totally unknown to the so-called mutants, realization of what was going on dawned on them slowly. The members of the host community thought they had forgotten where they left things, or just misjudged how much food was left, until these incidents finally happened often enough and to enough different people that they began to put 2 and 2 together and come up with the concept of theft. It was decided that a meeting should be called in order to address this new problem openly, with hope of understanding and resolution. The mutants genuinely wanted to know why the new community members would steal when nothing was withheld from them. But the rebels had a different kind of history with group meetings for problem solving, and therefore approached the mutants defensively and with undue caution. The mutants were extremely tactful and gentle with the rebels as they broached the subject at hand. A point was made of first praising the new arrivals and thanking them for the good they had brought to the colony so far. When the subject of missing objects and food was brought out, the guilty rebels became angry and defensive, while the hosts puzzled at and feared their reactions. The rebels mistook these responses for weakness and simple-mindedness and began to formulate a subconscious group mindset about taking control of the new colony. Some of the members of the rebel group had been sufficiently impacted by the purity and generosity of the mutant group that they spoke up. They told the mutants that where they had come from, they had lapsed into stealing, and at times even harming others just to survive. They confessed that they had further resorted to violence out of anger at times. Though the rebels still concealed their worst crimes, their stories helped the mutants understand the source of their deviant behavior sufficiently enough to stir compassion in them. Soon, everyone was communicating civilly again, with minimal guardedness on the part of the guilty ones. All was forgiven, and the rebels were encouraged to ask for what they needed. Assurance was given that if the mutants could not meet their needs immediately, every effort would be made to help in the manufacture of the right tools and the harvest of the right foods. For a while, everything went well between the groups. They even began to share cultural differences, historic stories, and spiritual music. Both groups were appalled at the absence of historical records about the mutant society. When this was discovered, a deep silence fell over the mutant people, who were laden with old hurts, wounds, and prejudices. Those of a more competitive nature among the rebels began to fear the mutants, seeing themselves as superior to them, and encouraged their friends to segregate in order to protect the purity of their race. Some listened and, in fear of being polluted by these ancient ancestors, began to separate from them more and more. Although nothing was overtly expressed, the tension increased, and old feelings of shame and victimization began to surface in the mutant people. Distrust was palpable on both sides, but unspoken. Some of the converted rebels were totally open to and loving and grateful toward the mutants. They sided with them against the more hostile rebels. Rebels control and declare war on mutants. Year 3801. Slowly but certainly, small quarrels rose to the surface. The concept of better than and less than grew in the people. The rebels took on the dangerous superiority of a previously oppressed race, and the mutants felt less open and trusting, as well as resentful of the old shames being dredged up from their group consciousness. Neither group took the obvious opportunity for self-examination and healing, and instead, subtleties became passive-aggressive behavior, which became segregation, which became stronger resentment and distrust. Eventually, this process led the rebels to impose the same illegal breeding laws upon the mutants as their ancestors had done centuries before, and the shadowy nightmares in the subconscious minds of all concerned slowly began to surface. At first, the mutants tried to reason with the rebels by virtue of their generosity and openness to the new people. When this did not work, they offered coexistence with segregated living. When that did not work, they began to develop weapons for self-protection and to preserve their sovereignty. This time, however, they did not offer to leave, as this place was their home. Eventually, the rebels were asked to leave, except those who had melded with their culture and begun to intermarry. The righteous rebels were indignant with this last request and declared war on their former hosts. Though the rebels were greatly outnumbered, they were more experienced in violence, sneakiness, and instilling fear in others. They raped and killed some mutant women. They dismembered some male children and created an atmosphere of hatred and fear everywhere around them. In the meantime, one elder among the mutant race remembered the promise of divine intervention if the majority requested it. The people immediately gathered in the middle of the night and by consensus requested that the violent rebels be removed from their colony and the planet. The plan worked. That night, a huge tornado came over the area where the rebels had built their homes, and all of the rebels were killed. The mutants were in a state of shock at this turn of events. They had expected something more gracious, like the rebels deciding to leave on their own, or perhaps an opening in the clouds and a non-violent group removing of the rebels. This extreme yet natural phenomenon shook them and filled them anew with guilt, shame, and feelings of deserving punishment. In other words, their victim mentality took a quantum leap. End of the first evolutionary cycle, year 5200. The natural, cultural, and technological progress of evolving races continued throughout the rest of the first 5200 years of colonization. The so-called beautiful people grew in artistic accomplishment, as did their accompanying sense of class division and prejudices. They even developed a government to make sure the servant classes remained in order and to check the ongoing, though diminished, violence. They became a civilization of arrogant artisans and wealth holders, middle-class workers, including most government officials and lesser artisans, and lower-class servers and common laborers. Overt displays of resentment and prejudice were kept to a minimum most of the time. The government became very popular with the wealthy. People in general were extremely repressed emotionally and verbally, as their civilization was based on better than less than thinking, and was nearly devoid of any spiritual values. The mutant race continued to improve mentally and even physically, with the introduction of the few remaining rebel converts to the community. Spiritual principles continued to overrule the physical obsessions of their so-called beautiful ancestors, and these people maintain a reasonably peaceful existence in spite of the increase in repressed fear, shame, guilt, and hatred brought on by the rebel invaders. When the 5200-year mark was approaching, some of the Andromedan angels who had remained as guides and plant devas carried out their initial plans to incarnate at that time in order to bring about the conscious choices necessary to plan the next 5200 years of Venusian colonization. Those angels born into both colonies were strikingly different in temperament and somewhat different in appearance from the existing cultures. There was a purity about them that had long been lost to both groups, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and even physically to a degree. Of course, they carried the genetics of the race, complete with the mutations brought on by repression, prejudice, and other deviant attitudes over the previous 5,200 years. Consciously pure of spirit, their memories of what had taken place over the centuries since colonization began were mostly intact. The newborn angels were pre-programmed to awaken these memories during early puberty. Slowly, both cultures began to be filled with stories of Andromedan angels, sovereignty, and the equality of spirit. The stories also told of the 5,200-year turning point, when their progress would be assessed by the hierarchies and themselves to decide upon the next steps in the evolution to be taken on Venus. Needless to say, both groups had more than a little to think about. Both colonies originally resisted the ideas being brought to them by these young souls. But as more and more of these angels were born and independently kept telling the same stories and giving the same predictions, the rest of the Venusians began to listen. The newly born angels assisted in the healing process, as residents of both colonies experienced deep feelings that had been buried for a long time. The use of signature plants was introduced for restoration of health and DNA. The newborns helped many people access their own subconscious minds and emotions to find the long-buried memories and truths. But many were not willing to heal and change or acknowledge the need for it. Arrogance, self-righteousness, prejudice, and fear of relinquishing power held the wealthy and government people firmly in outmoded ways. These people threatened and intimidated new believers, but could not stop them. The believers heard and healed to a degree, but then they began to feel spiritually superior and prejudiced against the elitist holdouts. A reverse prejudice, as you might call it. In the mutant colony, the healing and transformation was by consensus. The mutants began to understand their deep-seated shame and prejudice against their own physical appearance. They began to get in touch with the deeper anger and hurt they felt towards their beautiful oppressors. They also let go of the guilt regarding the removal of the rebels. The angels assured them that the rebels had been taken to another planet to work out their own karmic problems. The other planet was called Mars, and it showed in the night sky at certain times of the year. The mutants and converted rebels would hold night meetings, during which they would look to Mars in the sky and sing to the planet and the people on it, asking them to forgive and let go of their pain. They began to pray to the hierarchies to help these new Martians grow and heal. As they prayed, their own emotional wounds healed as well. They asked for guidance and for help in becoming what they were divinely intended to be. The need for genetic purification was understood, and it was happening as much as it could with the use of signature plants and emotional and mental healing. In the year 5200, a great earthquake happened, or maybe it should be called a Venus quake. The rivers and streams flooded and destroyed much of both colonies' surrounding areas and some of their homes. About 20% of the people were killed in these natural disasters, which were being used to clear spiritual and emotional karma and mental thought forms. The message in the events was one of purification and clearing. The people were shocked, and yet the newly born angels were able to explain the pontification in such a way that most of the people understood. Some members of both colonies were resentful and felt they were being punished by the higher council and An, the supreme being. These thought forms went with them into the next era in the form of distrust and fear of the divine, the high council, and of An in particular.